Hey, it's Alpha here, and today we're continuing with the Demystifying Shadow Work series. So let's quickly recap a few things from the first video. We explore how the shadow is simply a term that refers to everything that is unconscious and we are unaware about ourselves. And this also means that the shadow is neutral and it contains both positive and negative parts. And speaking of these parts, you probably heard people talking about parts or aspects of the personality before. However, hardly anybody discusses complexes, which are the main elements of the personal shadow. And to be honest, I was kind of shocked when I understood that these complexes can basically shape our entire lives and relationships and are responsible for our patterns of behaviors. And that's why I like calling these complexes the puppet masters. And before we begin our exploration, I want to remind you that this whole series is based on my book Pistis, Demystifying Jungian Psychology, and you can claim your copy when you join my newsletter down below. Now, to start, we have to understand that Carl Jung divides the unconscious into two parts. We have the personal unconscious and the impersonal or collective unconscious. And the first one contains lost memories, painful ideas that are repressed, subliminal perceptions, and contents that aren't ready to be made conscious yet. And it's important to understand that contents are personal when we can connect them with our life experiences. Also, the personal unconscious is mainly made out of complexes, the ones we just discussed, and they correspond to the figures of the shadow. Again, these complexes correspond to the figure of the shadow, and we usually meet the shadow figure in our dreams and during active imagination sessions. And in contrast, the collective unconscious is mainly made out of archetypes. And in summary, an archetype is like a blueprint, a structure, or a pattern. And now you can say that, well, the shadow is an archetype, and this is true. And this means that as humans, we tend to experience its effects, confrontation, and integration in a similar way. However, intellectually naming and learning about archetypes is pretty much useless. Even if there are archetypes at play, in this case the shadow or the mother or father archetype, we always have to understand how they're being expressed in an individual context. And that's why we will focus mainly on complexes. So in that sense, neurosis happens when we adopt a rigid and unilateral conscious attitude. And now I need you to remember the first video. And this rigid conscious attitude causes a split between conscious and unconscious. Now the individual is dominated by his shadow and therefore his complexes. And by the way, when we use this word neurosis, we're basically referring to common symptoms of anxiety, depression, toxic relationship patterns, compulsions, and the list goes on. It's basically this state of inner tension. Now, these complexes are basically an amalgamation of experiences around a theme, like the mother or father complex, an inferiority complex, a power complex, or even a creativity complex. And as I said, people commonly refer to these complexes as parts or aspects of the personality. And these complexes can be grouped around archetypes, like the mother and father archetype. But always remember that their nucleus is always the individual experience. So what I mean by that is my mother complex contains experiences with my own mother, and not this abstract idea of an archetype. And your parental complex will contain your own experiences. Now, it's interesting that these complexes have an autonomous nature, and they tend to present themselves in a personified form. So what I mean by that is that these complexes will appear as the characters in our dreams and will be the figures we encounter during active imagination, because the nature of the unconscious is to be personified. And a modern example of the effects of a complex is Bruce Banner and the Hulk. So, in my opinion, Bruce Banner aligns with the introverted thinking type, and his conscious attitude is that he's very timid, quiet, and he basically acts like a coward most of the time. So this conscious attitude represses an expression of emotion, assertiveness, aggression, and confidence. And now remember that the relationship between conscious and unconscious is compensatory and complementary. So as a compensation for this cowardly conscious attitude, we have the Hulk, this giant, impulsive, and fearless beast fueled by rage. But we have to take a step back because it's easy to assume that all complexes are evil. But once again, it's our conscious attitude that determines how we experience a complex. So, do you remember the example I gave you about creativity and anger in the first video? So, I repeat, the problem isn't the shadow, but how we perceive and engage with it. Now, in the beginning, I said that these complexes can shape our entire lives. And we can see the effects of a complex whenever there are overreactions, like being taken by a sudden rage, like the Hulk, or a sadness, when we engage in toxic relationship patterns, or when we experience common symptoms of anxiety and depression. And the crazy thing is that while these complexes are unconscious, they have no relationship with the ego. And that's why we can feel like there's a foreign body pulling the strings and manipulating our every move. And again, that's why I like referring to these complexes as the puppet masters. And to deal with these complexes, it's crucial to understand that they distort our interpretation of reality and shape our sense of identity by producing fixed narratives that play on repeat in our minds. And these stories prime us to see ourselves and the world in a certain way, also driving our behaviors and decisions. And the less conscious we are about these complexes, the more power they have over us. So in that sense, neurosis means that a complex and a script is ruling the conscious mind and traps us in a repeating storyline. So it's just like that movie Groundhog Day. And there are complexes around money and achieving financial success, about our self-image, our true capabilities, what we deserve in relationships, and the list continues. And the only way to break free from these narratives is by first taking the time to understand them and realize how we are contributing to keeping them alive. And once we can map these complexes and stories, we can take the necessary action to disrupt these narratives and finally create new ones. And this is exactly what I teach in my accessible course Katabasis The Shadow Integration Manual. And if you'd like my personal help, I also invite you to check my mentorship down below. But now I'll give you an example. So a lot of people carry a complex revolving around shame. And there's a compensation for these feelings of inferiority, inadequacy, and feeling like there's something, wrong with you, basically. These people end up developing high levels of perfectionism. And again, I have a whole video about it on the channel, and I'll link it over here and also down below for you. So somewhere along the way, these people internalize the message that their value is attached to their performance and external results. So in other words, their self-worth is attached to how good their grades are, how well they can perform at work, or how much money they make. And they will identify with their titles and accomplishments, with being the smartest person, or even the perfect partner or a parent. So they live inside a script in which they're never good enough. And because their sense of value is externally based, they have the childish belief that if somehow they can become perfect, they will finally feel loved and accepted. So in that sense, perfectionism becomes a strategy to earn love and not be abandoned. But in this process, they lose touch with who they truly are and start operating based on what can give them the most validation. And this is a key element because they start conflating validation with real love and intimacy. And unfortunately, the exact thing they don't want to happen always happen. They always feel abandoned because they never reveal their true selves, they're afraid of intimacy, and they can't show any vulnerability. Now, the right way to work with these complexes and narratives is by first investigating their origins. Though in this case, we'll probably analyze the relationship with the caregivers and what experiences shaped these stories. And this is an important step because when something becomes conscious, especially when it's an inherited pattern, let's say, it usually loses that overwhelming grip. And then we have to come back to the present moment and analyze what behaviors are keeping this narrative alive. So in this case, there's usually a lot of people pleasing, pushing people away, and sometimes adopting the role of caretaker in relationships. So once we map these behaviors, we can finally start adopting new strategies. And finally, it's important to uncover all the repressed aspects covered by shame, especially the good ones, and devote time and energy to cultivating them. And that way, a fundamental shift can happen from constantly seeking external validation to, finally finding self-love and feeling at peace with who they are. And I know this is just one example, but I hope it illustrates how complexes can shape our lives and how often we are walking in the world with narratives and stories that were formed when we were children and we don't even know it. And now I want to take things one step further. What I didn't tell you until now is that these complexes are also the main material for our projections, and learning how to withdraw these projections is the foundation of shadow integration. Because everything that is unconscious is first encountered projected. So, in other words, our shadow is always first encountered projected. And once again, we are referring to good and bad qualities. And because complexes produce fixed scripts, they also evoke relationship patterns. So this means that we unconsciously engage with people to perpetuate these narratives and stories. The external mirrors our internal dynamics. For instance, someone with intimacy issues will have an unconscious tendency to go after emotional, unavailable people who can potentially abandon them. Or they will find a way to sabotage the relationship as soon as it starts to get serious. But as I've seen, to disrupt these narratives, it's important to realize that something inside of us is running the show and take responsibility for it. So now, let's get more practical. The most flagrant signs of a complex operating are overreactions, aka feeling triggered, and compulsive behaviors. Now, a projection only takes place via a projective hook. So, in other words, the person in question often possesses the quality you are seeing. However, projection always amplifies it, often to a superhuman or inhuman degree. For instance, for someone who is more a people pleaser and has difficulty asserting their boundaries and constantly avoids conflict, interacting with someone who's more direct and upfront might evoke a perception of them being highly narcissistic and tyrannical, even if they're acting somewhat normal. And now, to end this video, I want to share 7 pointers for you to better spot projections. And again, you can find all of them in my book. Alright, so I'm going to read them to you. The first one: you see the person as all good or all bad. The person is reduced to a single attribute, like being a narcissist or the ultimate flawless spiritual master. You put them on a pedestal or feel the need to show your superiority. You change your behavior around them. Their opinions matter more than your own. And you're frustrated when they don't correspond to the image you created about them. And lastly, you feel a compulsion toward them, aka a severe animus and anima entanglement or limerence. So as you can see, projection significantly reduces our ability to see people as a nuanced human being. And while they are mythologized in our minds, they will exert immense power over us. But when we withdraw a projection, we can finally see the real person. Our emotional reactions diminish and their influence. And now, it's impossible to stop projecting entirely because the psyche is alive, and as our conscious attitude changes, the unconscious reacts. But we can create a healthy and positive relationship with our projections by understanding them as a message from the unconscious. Well, withdrawing projections requires a lot of responsibility. And realizing how often we act in the exact same ways we condemn. And in the case of a positive quality, like admiring someone's skill or intelligence, we must make it our duty to develop these capacities for ourselves, instead of making excuses. And finally, if you want to learn more about the best shadow work methods according to Carl Jung and why using shadow work prompts is probably a bad idea, you should check the next video over here.